Bloodborne has been picked apart by thousands of players for a decade now, and somehow there are still corners of this game where the rules quietly stop applying, where the world does something it was never supposed to do, and where the line between intended design and outright accident gets genuinely hard to find. I put this video together because I kept running into anomalies during my own playthroughs that I couldn't find clean explanations for. And when I started digging into forums, patch notes, and obscure community research, I realised just how many of these things exist and how little attention most of them get. When I was assembling this, I made a deliberate choice to focus not just on glitches, but on the stranger category of things that aren't clearly glitches at all. Some of what you're going to hear might be engine behaviour. Some of it might be leftover content from a version of the game that never shipped. And some of it sits in this uncomfortable space where we genuinely don't know what it is. I leaned into that uncertainty rather than away from it, because I think that's actually what makes Bloodborne so interesting to talk about. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The geometry that doesn't belong. Yharnam is a city built with extraordinary density. Every alley connects to something, every rooftop has a reason for being where it is, and the whole layout suggests a team of people who thought very carefully about how a player would experience moving through space. That attention to detail is part of why the anomalies in the geometry stand out so much. When something doesn't fit, it really doesn't fit, and Bloodborne has a handful of locations where the physical space itself seems to be operating under different rules than everything around it. The most discussed of these is the stretch of road near the entrance to the cathedral ward that sits slightly above the ground plane. Most players never notice it because you're usually running through that area, either heading toward the ward or backtracking towards central Yharnam. But if you stop and look carefully at the cobblestones along the left side of that path, there's a strip of geometry that doesn't quite meet the rest of the road's surface. It creates a barely visible seam. It has no gameplay effect. Nothing falls through it, and nothing clips against it. It's just there, a strip of space that technically shouldn't exist, sitting quietly in one of the most travelled corridors in the game. What makes this interesting isn't the seam itself. Seams in level geometry happen in basically every large-scale game ever made, and most of them are genuinely just artifacts of how environments get stitched together during development. What makes this one worth talking about is where it is. The Cathedral Ward entrance is one of the most visible and heavily trafficked areas in Bloodborne. If there was a point in development where someone was reviewing geometry and catching these kinds of issues, this is exactly the spot where you'd expect them to catch it. The fact that it survived to the final release suggests either that it appeared very late in production, or that it was noticed and deprioritized, which raises its own questions about what was happening in that stretch of development. There's a related anomaly on the upper rooftops of Cathedral Ward, in the area you access just before the fight with Vicar Amelia. The rooftops there have a section of walkable surface that extends slightly beyond where the visual geometry ends. If you walk toward the edge of one specific parapet and go a step further than you'd expect to be able to, you find that your character is standing on invisible ground for a moment before sliding off. It's a tiny space, maybe 2 steps worth of movement, but the collision is there and the visual mesh isn't. This one is almost certainly a legacy artifact, a piece of collision that got left in when the visual geometry above it was modified or removed at some point during development. The reason this matters for understanding Bloodborne's anomalies is that it points toward how the game was built. Bloodborne was made in a fairly compressed development window, and there are signs throughout the environment that the world changed significantly during production. Areas were likely larger at some point. Geometry was added, removed, and repositioned. The collision mesh and the visual mesh don't always move together in those situations, and sometimes you get these ghost surfaces, these invisible flaws that remember a version of the world that no longer exists visually. Old Yharnam has a more dramatic version of this. There's a point in the lower section of Old Yharnam, past the Jura encounter zone, where if you drop off a specific ledge and position yourself against the wall before landing, you can briefly clip through the wall and catch a glimpse of geometry that isn't visible from any normal position in the game. It's not a secret room, there's nothing there to find in any gameplay sense. It appears to be an unfinished continuation of the architecture that was sealed off rather than removed. The geometry behind that wall is clearly constructed, not random. It has floor surfaces and what look like wall segments that suggest it was meant to be traversable at some point. Community researchers who have examined this area more systematically, using camera mods and out-of-bounds exploration, have noted that the geometry extends further than you'd expect for something that was just a placeholder or a backing surface. It looks like the beginning of a path that continues for a meaningful distance before stopping abruptly at a gap. The prevailing interpretation is that this was an early version of a route through Old Yharnam that got replaced with the current layout, and that the replacement happened late enough in production that removing the old geometry entirely wasn't practical, so it got sealed instead. This pattern of sealed geometry shows up in other places too. There's a door in the Healing Church workshop that has fully rendered door geometry on both sides, but no trigger to open it from either direction. It isn't locked in any typical sense, it just doesn't respond to input at all. The door is there, the frame is there. The space on the other side, as far as anyone has been able to determine from out-of-bounds exploration, is empty. It's a door that goes nowhere, rendered as if it goes somewhere, sitting in a location that you walk past multiple times on a typical playthrough. The Forbidden Woods has a section of cliff edge where the ground texture transitions incorrectly. The visual surface shows grass meeting stone, but the transition happens several feet before the collision. What this means practically is that your character appears to be walking on stone, while the visual feedback says you should be on grass, and then you hit the actual collision edge of the cliff a step or two further out than the visual suggests. It's disorienting if you notice it, mostly because the visual and physical information are telling you different things simultaneously. This kind of texture collision offset is unusual in a game like Bloodborne because the environments are generally very carefully built. From Software's other titles have their share of rough geometry, but Bloodborne specifically received additional attention to environmental polish, which is part of what makes its anomalies feel anomalous. The Forbidden Woods cliff offset doesn't feel like it feels like a change that happened at some point, where either the cliff was extended or the texture was shifted, and the two systems didn't update in sync. The Nightmare of Mensis has some of the strangest geometry in the game, which is partly intentional and partly not. The nightmare spaces in Bloodborne are deliberately designed to feel wrong, with roads that float without support and architecture that makes no structural sense. That's the point. But within that intentionally disorienting space, there are specific spots where something different is. There's a section of the floating road system in Mensis where if you stand in a particular corner, the draw distance system fails and you can see geometry loading in from distances that normally wouldn't trigger it. It's a visual artifact, nothing more, but it gives you a momentary glimpse of just how much geometry is packed into that nightmare space beyond what's visible under normal rendering. The winter lanterns in Mensis occupy specific patrol routes, and there's one lantern that has a patrol route overlapping with a geometry edge, in a way that causes it to occasionally clip partway into the... It doesn't affect the enemy's behaviour, it still functions exactly as you'd expect. But the visual of a winter lantern sinking knee deep into the ground mid-patrol is jarring in a way that makes the creature look even stranger than it already does. Which, in a nightmare space populated by brain-stealing ambulating nightmare bells, is genuinely sad. Canehurst Castle has a specific anomaly that took years to get documented properly. On the upper exterior walkways of the castle, there is a stretch of railing that has full collision on the wrong side. If you press against it from the exterior, You can lean over the edge further than the railing should allow, because the collision surface is oriented inward. Coming from the inside, you collide with empty space several inches before you'd visually expect to. It creates this weird push and pull effect where the railing simultaneously lets you lean too far out on one side and stops you too early on the other. The lecture hall has geometry anomalies of a different kind. The lecture hall exists in a peculiar space relative to the rest of the game's world, sitting between the waking world and the deeper nightmare layers, and its geometry reflects that strange positioning. There are several spots in the lecture hall where the room appears to be one size from the interior but the exterior shell of the building, visible from certain angles during loading transitions, doesn't match those interior dimensions. The inside of some rooms appears to be larger than the outside of the building they're supposedly contained within. This is common in games with instant spaces, but the lecture hall's transitions between the first and second floors make it especially visible. The research hall in the old Hunter's Dielk. The research hall is a vertically oriented space with multiple levels connected by ladders and platforms, and the geometry of the upper levels doesn't actually exist in the same continuous space as the lower level. If you examine where the level boundaries are during the vertical traversal, there are loading seams that suggest the top of the research hall is essentially a separate location that gets loaded when you climb high enough. This isn't unusual for large vertical spaces in games, but the seam placement means that certain lighting effects from the lower floors don't propagate correctly to the upper floors, creating inconsistencies in how the space feels tonally, even before you get to what's up there. Lady Maria's arena, while being one of the most beautifully realised spaces in the entire game, has a collision anomaly on the edge of the circular platform that can cause a specific kind of death that doesn't register. If you position yourself at the very boundary of the arena and get hit by a specific attack pattern from Maria, there's a small zone where your character can go off the edge, but the death trigger activates before the fall animation completes. You die in a standing position, hovering over the void for a fraction of a second before the death screen appears. It doesn't happen often and requires very specific positioning, but it's been documented multiple times, and it produces this genuinely uncanny visual of a character expiring while standing over nothing. The fishing hamlet has some of the most interesting geometry anomalies in the DLC, primarily because the hamlet is itself built with this oppressive downward slope that creates some unusual edge cases in how the game handles fall detection. There are multiple spots in the hamlet's upper paths where you can position yourself in ways that the fall detection system interprets as being on solid ground, even though you're clearly hanging over open water visually. Your character stands normally, takes no damage, and only falls when you move. The detection radius around your feet is apparently calculated in a way that doesn't account for the slope angle correctly, so the system thinks you have ground beneath you when you're actually cantilevered over the... The Chalice dungeons deserve their own extended treatment when it comes to geometry anomalies, but as part of this overview it's worth noting that the procedurally generated rooms in the dungeons sometimes produce combinations that the level geometry system wasn't designed to handle. Rooms get generated with stairs that lead into walls. Doors appear in positions that have no corresponding room on the other side. There are documented cases of Chalice dungeon layouts generating a room with 2 entrance points but only 1 exit, creating a topological impossibility that the game navigates by just not rendering the second entrance as a usable door. It sits there, correct in every visual detail, and doesn't function. What all of these geometry anomalies share is that they're not random. They cluster in specific types of locations, transitions between areas, the edges of environments, spaces that were clearly modified late in development, and procedurally generated content where the combinatorial possibilities exceeded what was manually verified. Bloodborne's world feels seamless on the surface, and it largely is. But underneath that surface there are these seams and gaps and ghost surfaces that tell a different story about how the world was actually put together. The rooftops of central Yharnam have an area near the large torch where two building surfaces meet at an angle that creates a tiny recessed space just large enough for your character to stand in. Getting into this space requires a very specific jump that most players would never attempt because there's no visible reward or reason to do it. But if you get in there and look outward, the rendering system produces an incorrect frame of the environment. A view of Yharnam from a position the camera was never supposed to occupy. The buildings in the foreground render at their full detail level. The buildings slightly further back begin to load in their lower detail versions as if they're at a much greater distance. The result is a jarring shift in visual fidelity in the middle of a scene, as if two different versions of the city are occupying the same space simultaneously. The bridge connecting the cathedral ward to the area above the cleric beast fight has an odd geometry feature that only reveals itself if you fall off the bridge and catch the underside on the way down. The underside of the bridge is rendered with full geometry, including surface detail that would never be visible during normal play. It's been there since launch, and it serves no visible purpose. The most common interpretation is that the bridge geometry was built as a solid mesh rather than a surface-only mesh, which is a legitimate construction choice that prevents certain types of rendering artifacts. But it does mean that there is a fully detailed underside of a bridge, floating in an area of the game that no living player is supposed to see. The lanterns that serve as bonfire equivalents have an interesting geometry quirk where the activation prompt appears slightly offset from the actual lantern object in specific rooms. This is most noticeable in certain Chalice dungeon configurations, where the room generation places the lantern close to a wall, and the prompt hitbox ends up partially inside the wall rather than centered on the lantern. You can activate a lantern from inside the adjacent wall in these cases. This isn't game-breaking in any meaningful way, but it's a clean example of how the fixed asset lanterns interact awkwardly with the generated room geometry in ways the system wasn't quite designed to handle. Byggenworth has an exterior area with a low wall along the lakeside where the collision mesh extends about half a character width beyond the visible edge of the wall. This means you can appear to be standing in thin air over the lake if you hug the outer edge of that wall from the outside. It's a subtle discrepancy, the kind that most players would interpret as their character just having wide, but when you look at it directly, the gap between where you appear to be standing and where any visible surface exists is genuinely several inches of nothing. The Hypogean Gaol, the prison area connected to Yharnam, has a specific cell where the door geometry generates a shadow that falls in a direction inconsistent with the light source. Every other shadow in the room tracks correctly with the ceiling fixture. The cell door's shadow falls at a roughly 90-degree offset from where it should be, based on the light position. This suggests either that the door geometry was imported or repositioned late in production from a different area with a different light setup, or that there's a secondary light source in the room that only the door's shadow casting system is reading. Neither explanation is fully satisfying, which is sort of the point. The Nightmare Frontier has the densest concentration of geometry anomalies in the base game, which makes sense given that it's a nightmare space where the physical rules of Yharnam don't fully apply. But some of the anomalies there feel less like intentional weirdness and more like genuine construction errors. There's a path in the Frontier that curves around the edge of the main pit, and along that path there are several spots where the ground texture tiles visibly incorrectly, with the tiling seam running across the path at an angle that the texture wasn't designed to accommodate. It produces a visual stutter in the ground surface, as if the path is striped with slightly darker lines every few feet. Depth 2 Chalice dungeons specifically have a higher rate of geometry anomalies than Depth 1 or Depth 3. The prevailing theory is that Depth 2 represents the generation settings where room variety is highest and the combinations are most diverse, which creates more opportunities for edge cases. Depth 1 is simpler, and Depth 3 uses a more constrained generation profile. Depth 2 is where the system is most adventurous, and therefore most likely to produce combinations that produce visible artifacts. The Forbidden Woods village area, the section with the pig enemies and the poison swamp approach, has a building whose interior space is accessible through a window, but whose interior geometry doesn't match the exterior. The building appears from the outside to be a single-story structure. The accessible interior through the window is a full 2-story space. This kind of spatial inconsistency is common enough in games that it rarely gets commented on, but Bloodborne's general geometric precision makes it noticeable when it happens. The outside of this building says one thing, and the inside says another, and the game simply doesn't acknowledge the discrepancy. The Grand Cathedral itself, where Vicar Amelia's fight takes place, has a skybox anomaly that becomes visible if you enter the fight and then look upward at a specific angle during the opening moments. The interior of the cathedral has a vaulted ceiling, but above that ceiling, visible through a rendering gap that appears at certain camera angles, there is the exterior night sky. The cathedral's ceiling is geometry sitting inside an open-air shell, and the shell doesn't have a roof. Under normal gameplay conditions, you never see this because you're looking across the arena, not straight up. But if you catch it, the cathedral momentarily looks like a roofless ruin with a floating stone ceiling, which is strange in a different way than it's intended to be. The path through central Yharnam, leading toward the cleric beast, has a wall section that appears in different states of damage depending on which direction you're travelling. Approaching from the cleric beast side, the wall is intact. Approaching from the gate side, there's visible damage on that same wall section. The damage geometry exists from one direction and doesn't exist from the other. It's a bidirectional inconsistency in the world state that appears to have been missed during review. Neither version is wrong for the area's aesthetic. A deteriorating city has walls in various states of damage, but having the same wall be simultaneously damaged and undamaged, depending on your angle of approach, is a specific kind of visual error. The church doctors in the cathedral ward, specifically the ones in the open area before the Great Bridge, have patrol routes that occasionally take them partially into the interior of a decorative pillar. They don't clip through it entirely. They just sort of press against it and lean into it during the turn phase of their patrol, as if the pillar collision isn't quite registering for their pathfinding system. It's a minor NPC behavior anomaly, but it happens consistently on that specific patrol route, suggesting something in the pillar geometry is confusing the pathfinding in a small but repeatable way. The lecture building's second floor, accessed through the shortcut door after using the Hunter's Nightmare lantern, has ambient sound that doesn't correctly transition when you move between the two floors. The sound of wind and distant howling that plays in the first floor should fade out as you ascend. Instead, it continues at roughly the same volume on the second floor for several seconds before cutting to the appropriate, quieter ambience. It's an audio geometry boundary issue. The invisible sphere that triggers the audio transition appears to be positioned slightly too high, so you're already on the second floor before the audio system registers the change. The Iosefka's clinic starting area has a geometry feature that has been discussed extensively in speedrunning communities. There's a wall in the first room that has what appears to be a door frame moulded into the plaster, the visual suggestion of a door that doesn't exist and has no corresponding door on the other side of the wall. The frame is clearly rendered. It has the trim detail of a real door frame, but there's no door, no interactive element, and no space on the other side that corresponds to it. This has led to considerable speculation about whether there was meant to be a door there that connected to a different starting configuration, and the frame was left in when the door itself was removed. Central Yharnam sewers have a water surface that doesn't respond correctly to the player character moving through it in one specific section near the ladder that leads up to the shortcut. In most parts of the sewers, moving through the water produces wake effects and sound. In this one section, the wake effect appears, but the sound doesn't trigger, and the visual of the wake is slightly delayed relative to the movement. It's a very small audio-visual desync confined to a specific portion of the sewer geometry, and it suggests that section of the environment was modified at some point in a way that affected how the water surface interactions were calculated. The bridge over the poisoned river in the Forbidden Woods has support structures below the bridge surface that are fully rendered, despite being completely invisible during any legitimate traversal of the bridge. If you drop off the bridge into the poison river below, you die before you can look back up at the underside. The supports are only visible through out-of-bounds camera exploration. They're geometrically complex, with detail work that goes well beyond a simple placeholder backing mesh. Someone modelled these supports in full detail for a surface that would never be seen under any normal gameplay condition. Whether that was a decision made before the final traversal path was established, or just a byproduct of how the bridge mesh was constructed, isn't clear. Old Yharnam's tower, where Dura sits with his Gatling gun, has a floor section on the upper level that produces an incorrect footstep sound. The visual surface is stone, consistent with the rest of the tower, but your footstep audio on that section plays the wood surface sound. It's a collision material assignment issue. A piece of the floor was tagged with the wrong surface type at some point. It happens on every playthrough, consistent as a sunrise. You hear yourself walking on wood in a stone tower. The Yharnam Unseen Village has two versions that exist as separate loaded environments depending on when you visit. The daytime version, after being taken there by the kidnapper enemies, and the nighttime version, after ringing the bell in Hypogean Gaol. These two versions of the same location occasionally interact in ways that suggest the game's state management has trouble keeping them fully separate. There are edge cases where lighting values from the nighttime version bleed into the daytime version's loading parameters, producing sections of Yharnam that look slightly darker than they should during a daytime visit, as if some of the night version's shadow settings are influencing the wrong environment. The lampposts in Cathedral Ward have a flicker pattern that isn't random. If you stand and watch a specific post near the staircase leading up toward the Healing Church workshop, it flickers on a cycle of approximately 42 seconds. Every time. The flicker itself isn't unusual. Flickering lampposts are an aesthetic choice throughout Yharnam, but the fact that this particular post has a precise repeating cycle rather than the variable flicker timing of the posts around it suggests something different is driving it. It may be tied to a scripted event timer that runs in the background for reasons unrelated to the lamppost itself. The Celestial Emissary Garden area in the Upper Cathedral Ward has two plants that are positioned partially inside each other. They're clearly meant to be two separate decorative plants placed close together, but the overlap means that parts of one plant's mesh intersect with parts of the others. Under most lighting conditions, it's barely noticeable. But when the camera angle catches it right, the interpenetration of the two meshes produces a brief visual artifact, a triangle of flickering geometry, where the two objects occupy the same space. It's small, and it's quiet, and it's been there since launch. The orphanage, accessible through the Upper Cathedral Ward, has a staircase geometry issue, where the top step of one interior staircase is slightly taller than the rest of the steps. It's not enough to affect the climbing animation. The game handles it without visible issue, but the step is measurably taller, and if you approach it straight on slowly, you can see your character's foot placement adjust slightly at that step versus every other step on the staircase. It suggests the staircase geometry was built in segments that were then assembled, and the measurement on that final step was slightly off in the assembly. The winter lanterns in the Nightmare of Mensis are among the most visually complex enemies in the game, and their complexity produces some specific rendering anomalies. The bell-shaped fleshy mass that forms the body of a winter lantern has a transparency value assigned to it for the ambient glow effect, and this transparency occasionally interacts incorrectly with other transparent surfaces in the environment, specifically the moonlit fog that fills portions of the Mensis nightmare. When a winter lantern walks through a fog patch, There are frames where the transparency compositing produces an incorrect layering order, and the fog appears to be behind the lantern's body, but in front of its glow, resulting in this thin slice of the lantern's light appearing to be on the wrong side of the environment. The amygdala that appears in the Cathedral Ward sky during the early game, the one you can actually fight in a later Chalice dungeon, casts an ambient shadow on the environment below it. That shadow doesn't move. The in-game time progression changes the lighting direction across most of Yharnam as the night progresses through the game's implied timeline, but the amygdala's shadow stays fixed. This means that as the ambient light direction shifts, the shadow on the ground becomes increasingly inconsistent with where it should be given the amygdala's position relative to the light source. By the late-game revisit to Cathedral Ward, the shadow is cast at a direction that makes no geometric sense for the amygdala's position in the sky. The central Yharnam lamp at the start of the game has a minor activation zone issue. The zone that triggers the fast travel menu is circular, as expected. But the visual prompt that appears when you enter that zone seems to track with a slightly different activation center than the actual menu trigger. You can be standing in a position where the prompt is visible, but pressing the interact button does nothing, and there's a thin ring of positions around the lamp where the prompt appears, but the lamp doesn't respond. Step slightly inward, and both the prompt and the function activate. This kind of hitbox offset between the prompt trigger and the function trigger is consistent across a specific subset of lamps in the game, suggesting a systematic offset in how those particular instances were placed. Chapter 2. Enemies that behave outside their programming. Bloodborne's enemy behavior is built on layered systems. Each enemy type has a base behavioral state machine that dictates how it responds to stimuli, a patrol route or idle state, an aggro range that triggers it to engage, a set of attacks with their own range and timing parameters, and a series of responses to being hit, staggered, or hearing sounds from other enemies. These systems are well documented through years of community analysis, and in the vast majority of encounters, they work exactly as designed. But there's a specific category of enemy behavior in Bloodborne that sits outside all of those documented systems. Things enemies do that the systems don't cleanly explain. The most fundamental of these involves the basic Yharnam mobs in central Yharnam. The torch and pitchfork citizens that populate the early streets are designed as a manageable challenge for new players, present enough to establish danger without being individually threatening. Their group behavior, where they react to hearing combat nearby and approach in loose clusters, is what's less well understood, is why specific citizens in specific locations occasionally fail to aggro to combat that should, by the numbers, be well within their detection radius. There are 3 citizens in central Yharnam, in a specific courtyard, who will not aggro to the sounds of combat happening less than 10 feet from them. The other citizens in the area aggro normally. These 3 stand. This has been tested extensively. It isn't about line of sight, because the detection system uses a radius rather than line of sight for audio aggro. It isn't about the specific enemies already being in a triggered state, because they're fresh on every visit. The 3 citizens appear to have an aggro range value of 0, or something so close to 0 as to be functional. They'll respond to being directly attacked, so they're not in an invulnerable or inactive state. They just don't react to nearby combat. Whether this is intentional, whether those 3 citizens are there to provide a specific safe corridor, or whether their aggro parameters got set incorrectly at some point, is genuinely. The huntsmen that patrol with dogs in central Yharnam have a behaviour anomaly that involves their dog companions' aggro radius conflicting with their own. The dogs have a wider aggro radius than the huntsman they're paired with. This is by design. The dog detects you first, and the huntsman then responds to the dog's alert. But in one specific encounter, in the alley near the shortcut gate, the dog aggros and charges while the paired huntsman continues patrolling as if nothing has happened. The huntsman never joins the fight. He just keeps walking his patrol route while his dog engages independently. This behavior is consistent across multiple visits to the area. The possible explanation is that the huntsman's partner alert system, the mechanism that causes him to react when the dog aggroes, has a range limit that happens to be shorter than the dog's aggro radius in that specific location. If the dog charges from far enough away, the huntsman's reaction trigger never fires, and the two entities decouple from each other. The dog fights, the huntsman patrols, and if you defeat the dog without the huntsman seeing you, the huntsman never reacts at all. You can walk past him while he continues his route, the dog lying dead in the alley behind you. Jura is one of the more behaviourally complex NPCs in the early game, and his behaviour has some anomalies that the community has spent considerable time. His primary function is to suppress player movement through Old Yharnam from his tower position using the Gatling gun. The Gatling gun fires within a specific area of effect, and outside that area, Jura ignores you completely. What's unusual is that the targeting system for the Gatling gun doesn't account for vertical position in the way you'd expect. At certain points in Old Yharnam, ascending or descending specific staircases puts you in a vertical position where you're technically within the horizontal targeting radius, but the gunfire misses entirely, tracking to where you'd be if you were at ground level rather than your actual elevated or lowered position. This suggests the targeting system calculates horizontal distance to the target position on the ground plane, and then fires at ground level, rather than calculating true three-dimensional distance and leading to the actual target position. It works correctly for most of Old Yharnam, because most of the area you're traversing is at ground level. The staircases are where the approximation. You can descend a staircase in Jura's line of fire and watch the bullets impact the ground in front of you at the base of the staircase while you walk down unharmed, the targeting system convinced you're already at the. The Shadows of Yharnam, the three-part boss encounter, have an aggro interaction that functions differently from any other multi-entity boss in the game. Each shadow is an independent entity with its own health pool and behavioural state, but they share an aggro system in a way that causes unusual behaviour when one of them gets separated from the others by a significant distance. If you use the fight geometry to push one shadow away from the other two, the isolated shadow will eventually stop tracking you and return toward the group, even if you're standing close to it. The aggro system seems to have a group cohesion priority that overrides individual aggro once the separation distance exceeds a certain threshold. Getting too far from the group, from the shadow's perspective, triggers a return behaviour that temporarily overrides the chase behaviour. This creates a specific and repeatable exploit where you can make the shadows non-aggressive by kiting them into a configuration where they're all individually separated enough to trigger the return behaviour simultaneously. In that state, all three shadows are focused on returning to a group formation rather than attacking you, and they're briefly passive. The window is short, and exploiting it in actual play is difficult, but it demonstrates that the group behaviour system has a specific priority ordering that produces this unusual emergent outcome. The brainsucker enemies in the Forbidden Woods and Yharnam have a casting behaviour that's supposed to be triggered by the player entering a specific range. The range trigger for their petrification cast fires correctly in most situations, but there's a behaviour anomaly where a brainsucker that has been hit with a quick-step time dodge into its cast will occasionally freeze in the precast animation and never complete the cast, staying in that raised arm pose until you hit it again. The animation system appears to be cancelling the cast correctly in response to the hit, but the behavioural state machine doesn't fully reset, leaving the enemy stuck in the post-cancel state of the cast with no transition defined back to idle or aggro. A second hit unsticks it, but in the frozen state, the brainsucker stands there with its arms raised while you can freely attack it. Rom the vacuous spider's spider minions have a behaviour that only appears under a very specific set of conditions. If you damage Rom enough to trigger the first phase transition before eliminating any spider minions, the minions don't despawn and respawn as they're supposed to at the phase transition. Instead, they remain present for the second phase, in addition to the new set of minions that spawn in. What you get is double the spider population for the second phase, approximately a combination of the survivors from the first phase and the fresh spawn of the second phase. This is clearly unintended. The transition sequence is supposed to despawn the first phase minions before summoning the second phase set. The condition under which this fails appears to be related to the damage timing of the final hit before the transition, where triggering the transition within a specific frame window prevents the cleanup routine from running. The shadows in the Nightmare of Mensis, the faceless translucent figures that wander the fortress, have a behaviour where they can be lined up in a way that makes them share a single aggro state despite being independent entities. If you position yourself between two shadows and then step sideways so that both of them are directly in front of you in a line, the one further away will sometimes not aggro even when the close one does. The far shadow stands idle, while its counterpart attacks you from a few feet away. The most likely explanation is a line of sight calculation that's using the near shadow's body as an obstruction for the far shadow's sight line, preventing the far shadow from acquiring you as a target, even though you're clearly visible. The Wet Nurse, the Murgo's Wet Nurse boss, has a behavioural anomaly in her clone phase that can produce a situation where one clone stays visible when it should have faded. The clone and fade mechanic is meant to create confusion about which figure is the real boss, but occasionally a clone remains at full visibility after it should have become semi-transparent, creating the visual situation of two fully opaque wet nurses in the arena simultaneously. This doesn't affect the fight in a harmful way. If anything, it makes the fight easier, because you can see more clearly which figures are where. But it suggests the fade trigger for the clone entities has a condition that occasionally doesn't fire, leaving the clone in an intermediate visible state. The Witch of Hemwick dual boss encounter has a specific glitch where one witch can become stuck behind the summoning altar geometry if she follows you around the altar during the fight. The altar is a large central piece that you can use for evasion, and the witch's pathfinding is designed to route around it. But if she gets to a specific angle relative to the altar, her pathfinding places her directly against one face of the altar's geometry, and she stops moving. She isn't frozen in the animation glitch sense. She's still playing her idle animations. She just stops navigating. The other witch continues operating normally. The stuck witch will unfreeze if you move to a position that places a clear angular path between her and you, at which point her pathfinding recalculates and she resumes the fight. The hunter NPCs you encounter as invaders in Bloodborne, the ones who invade specific world states as you build up insight, have a behavioural pattern that involves them reacting to the environment in ways that suggest slightly more complex pathfinding than the standard enemies. But there's one invaded encounter in the Hemwick Charnel Lane area where the invading hunter NPC will occasionally path directly into a corner and stop there, facing the wall, for a duration of approximately 15 to 20 seconds before resuming normal behaviour. During that time, they're attackable, not invulnerable. They just don't react to being hit, and don't resume aggro behaviour until the timer runs out. What triggers this corner-facing state is unclear. It doesn't appear to be linked to any specific action by the player. The lecture building students, the crawling mutated figures in the hallways of the lecture building, have an interesting behaviour when they're killed near. Their ragdoll physics will frequently position them across the doorway threshold in a way that creates a semi-visible body in both rooms simultaneously. The ragdoll settling behaviour doesn't have a boundary at the room threshold, so a body that lands across the doorway keeps half of itself in each space. If you then leave and return to the area, the bodies that have settled across thresholds despawn and respawn in their default positions, which is expected. But during the initial visit, watching a lecture building student settle into a position that spans two rooms is an odd physical effect in a space that's already deeply strange. The blood-starved beast has an attack pattern in its third phase that occasionally fires out of sequence. The third phase is supposed to trigger a specific attack choreography that starts with the acid spray and builds into the more aggressive close-range slashes. But under specific conditions, primarily when you stagger the beast at the exact moment the phase transition triggers. The third phase opens instead with the close-range slash sequence, then recovers into the acid spray. The transition has displaced the first two moves of the phase sequence. It doesn't make the fight harder or easier in any significant way, but the out-of-sequence opening to the third phase is disorienting if you've learnt the fight and are expecting the standard. Father Gascoigne has a pathing behaviour in his humanoid phase where he'll occasionally walk directly away from you if you maintain maximum range during his weapon-only phase. The design intention seems to be that he always moves toward the player, pressing the engagement. But there appears to be a minimum engagement range that his pathfinding targets, and if you maintain a distance significantly, the pathfinding correction overshoots, and he briefly walks in the wrong direction before recalculating. At maximum arena distance, you can sometimes watch Gascoigne take 2 or 3 steps directly away from you before his pathfinding reorients. The Cleric Beast, as the game's first boss, has a behavioural routine that's simpler than most and therefore shows its edges more clearly. There's a specific attack, the overhead smash, that has a tracking component which is supposed to stop updating the target position at the point of commitment. In most cases it does. But there's a documented behaviour where the tracking continues for an extra frame or 2 past commitment, producing an overhead smash that curves slightly at the end of its travel, following you partway through a dodge in a way that the other smash attacks don't. This isn't consistent. It happens in maybe 1 in 20 instances of the attack, and it appears to be related to frame timing between the animation commitment and the tracking. The celestial mob enemies in Upper Yharnam, the ones with multiple long arms, have a behaviour where their arm extension attack has a collision box that doesn't match its visual extent. The visual of the arm extending shows it reaching a certain distance, but the actual collision box is longer than the visual, by a small but meaningful amount. This means you can be hit by an arm attack that visually appears to have not reached you. The attack's impact point is outside the animation. If you see the arm reach toward you and think you've created enough space to be safe, the actual hitbox may still be occupying your position, even though the visual doesn't suggest it. The One Reborn, the Yharnam boss, has a behavioural loop that includes summoning the Bell Maidens on the surrounding towers. If you kill all the Bell Maidens before the summoning loop repeats, the One Reborn's behavioural script attempts to summon more, but finds no available maidens to play the animation. In that state, the One Reborn briefly stalls, and during the stall, its attack cycle doesn't advance. You can get a longer window between attacks than the design intends by clearing the maidens at the right point in the summoning loop. This is a known strategy among experienced players, but the mechanism behind it, a failed summon causing a behavioural stall, is genuinely an emergent consequence of clearing what most players assume to be optional objectives. The Amygdala boss in the Nightmare Frontier has a limb-based damage system that produces some unusual behaviour when specific limbs are destroyed. The arms have individual health pools and can be severed, which the design explicitly accounts for in the attack animations. The boss transitions to using the stumps as clubs once the hands are gone. But if you sever both arms during the phase where the amygdala is performing a specific 2-handed grab, the game doesn't have an animation for completing the grab with no hands. Instead, the amygdala freezes briefly in the grab pose, the hands visually gone, before transitioning out of the attack. The grab completes, but without the visual, and your character stands there, untouched, while the amygdala's animation system figures out what to do with a grabbing move that no longer has grabbers. The Shadows of Yharnam, revisiting them for a specific separate behaviour, have a snake summoning attack that occasionally summons the snakes in the wrong position. The snakes are supposed to emerge from the ground at specified coordinates relative to the shadow's position. But if the shadow is standing on a geometry slope or edge when the summon triggers, the position calculation uses the ground plane coordinates without accounting for the surface normal, placing the snake emergence point below the actual surface of the terrain. The snakes then partially clip through the ground when they emerge, visible from the waist up rather than rising from the surface. It happens infrequently because the specific slope geometry needed is rare, but it's been captured and documented in video form multiple times. The Michaelash boss fight, the chase through the nightmare, has an NPC pathfinding anomaly where Michaelash's route through the maze occasionally takes him through a wall rather than around it. The pathfinding nodes in the Michaelash arena have a navigation mesh that should prevent this, but there's a specific node configuration near one of the room transitions where Michaelash can briefly occupy the same space as the wall geometry during a turn. He clips through the corner for a moment, becomes briefly invisible, and then re-emerges on the other side. It happens during the second phase transition more reliably than at other points, suggesting the phase transition changes something about how his pathfinding calculates the turn. The Parl boss, the electric skeleton dog in Yharnam, has a behaviour where its tail attack tracking continues well past the visual commitment point. The tail is supposed to swing in a fixed arc once the attack commits, but the tracking on the base of the arc continues updating for longer than the visual suggests, which means the tail swing follows you through early portions of a dodge in a way that appears visually unfair. The attack looks like it should have missed and connects anyway, because the arc origin adjusted to partially compensate for your move. The watchdog of the Old Lords in the Chalice dungeons has a fire breath attack whose targeting fires at the platform you were on rather than the platform you're currently on. There's a half-second delay between when the targeting locks and when the attack fires, and in that half-second you can move to an adjacent platform. The fire breath will then track to where you were standing, not where you are. This is a reliable technique for making the attack completely miss. But the mechanism is interesting because most enemy attacks in Bloodborne fire at the current player position, not a cached previous position. The watchdog's fire breath seems to be using a position cache rather than a live position update for its targeting. Lawrence, the first vicar, the optional boss in the Old Hunters DLC, has a behaviour in his crawling phase where his body can occasionally become misaligned with his collision. The crawling phase involves Lawrence dragging himself across the arena, leaving fire trails, and his body animation sometimes desyncs from the underlying collision mesh, particularly on the arena slope. This means his body visually occupies one position, while his collision is in a slightly different position. The practical effect is that attacks aimed at his body visually sometimes don't connect, while attacks aimed at a position slightly ahead of where he appears to be will land. The misalignment corrects itself when his movement animation resets at the beginning of a new attack. The shark giants in the fishing hamlet have a specific behaviour anomaly related to their charge attack. The hamlet's downward slope means a charge attack initiated from high ground carries a different momentum than the same attack on flat terrain, which the game appears to account for in some cases, but not all. There are specific slope angles where the shark giant's charge commits to a trajectory and then continues at that trajectory even when the terrain beneath it, resulting in the giant briefly lifting off the ground mid-charge before the physics correct. The correction is instantaneous, the giant snaps back to the terrain surface, but the lifted moment is visually distinct from the normal attack behaviour. The fishing hamlet priests have an attack rotation that can get stuck in a loop if you interrupt their casting animation at a specific point. The interrupt causes them to restart the cast from the beginning, which is by design. But if you interrupt the restart before it completes, the behavioural counter that tracks which attack they've already executed this cycle doesn't interrupt them repeatedly at the right timing, and they'll attempt the same initial attack indefinitely rather than rotating through their attack patterns. It's a very specific timing window, and it requires sustained rapid interrupts to maintain, but it produces an enemy that's locked into a single attack loop with no way to break out of it as long as you maintain the interrupt. The hunting dogs in the early game have a behaviour where their stagger response can conflict with their aggro response under specific multi-hit conditions. If you stagger a dog at the same moment a second dog aggroes onto you, the staggered dog sometimes recovers into an idle state rather than an aggro state, as if the stagger interrupt cleared its aggro flag along with its current behavior. It'll stand in idle, looking at you, and need to reacquire you as a target by you attacking it or entering its aggro radius again. A dog that was actively trying to bite you is suddenly standing still, apparently having forgotten you. The small celestial children in the quiet area of the upper cathedral ward have a following behaviour where they trail behind you if you walk past them slowly, rather than running or attacking. This following behaviour is a known mechanic, and it's intentional. They're passive until provoked. But the range of their following behaviour is wider than most players, and there's a specific configuration in the main choir room where you can cause 5 or 6 of them to follow you simultaneously without triggering aggro. In that configuration, walking toward the exit triggers an aggro response based on distance from their origin point rather than distance from the player. They all aggro at once when you reach a certain point in the room, not when you do anything aggressive. The blood-starved beast in its second phase has a behaviour where the acid build-up on its hands can affect surfaces it touches during certain animations. There are positions in the fight where the beast performs the prowling low posture movement that precedes some of its second phase attacks, and during that prowl, it occasionally contacts the arena floor in a way that leaves a brief visual residue of the acid effect on the ground. This residue doesn't deal. It's just a visual artifact of the acid collision system, briefly registering the ground contact as a surface it should mark. The marks fade quickly. But in the right camera angle during an active fight, the arena floor briefly shows the ghost of where the beast has been. Chapter 3. Items, loot and the economy of the unintended Bloodborne's item system has layers that most players never. The surface layer is the pickup economy, the blood echoes and consumables that populate the game's environments in predetermined positions. Below that is the drop system, the probability tables that govern what enemies leave behind. And below that is a layer of item behaviour that doesn't fully fit either category. Items that appear where they shouldn't, drops that fall outside their probability, and interactions between items and the game systems that produce outcomes the design doesn't appear to have accounted for. The most immediately strange of these involves a bloodstone shard that appears in the Forbidden Woods near the Poison Swamp. It's positioned in a location that's technically off the standard item placement path, not floating in the usual way pickups are positioned, but sitting on the slope of a hill at an angle that suggests it may have been placed manually, but without the precise placement care that most items in the game receive. It doesn't behave like a normal item. Most Bloodborne pickups have a small gravitational magnet that makes them easy to grab when you walk past them. This shard doesn't. You have to stand almost exactly on top of it to get the prompt, and if you roll past it, it sometimes doesn't give a pickup prompt at all on the return pass, only resetting when you move to a certain distance and return. The item magnetism inconsistency points to something about how that specific pickup was placed in the world. The magnetism is a global system property. Items have it or they don't, based on how they were spawned. Standard placed pickups have it. Enemy drop items, spawned dynamically when an enemy dies, have a slightly different. The Forbidden Woods shard behaves more like a dynamically spawned drop than a placed pickup, which is unusual because it exists in a fixed position independently of any enemy dying nearby. One possible reading is that it was placed using the wrong spawn method during level construction, and nobody caught it. The pebble item has a well-documented anomaly where its throw arc changes depending on the elevation difference between you and the target. Pebbles are supposed to be a simple aggro tool that draw enemy attention. The throw is supposed to be straight and predictable. But when you throw a pebble downhill at a significant gradient, the arc calculation uses horizontal distance rather than actual three-dimensional distance for the physics projection, which means the pebble hits the ground significantly short of where the visual targeting suggests it will land. This matters for the pebble's actual function because an enemy needs to be close to where the pebble lands to aggro. Throwing downhill, you're drawing aggro from a shorter range than you think. The Molotov cocktail has an opposite anomaly. When thrown uphill, the arc calculation overestimates the needed power to compensate for the elevation change, and the Molotov lands further than the visual targeting suggests. You can use this to pull enemies from positions that you couldn't reach. The overcorrection in the uphill direction and the undercorrection in the downhill direction suggests the elevation compensation is a correction factor applied to the standard flat terrain calculation, and the factor overcompensates in one direction and undercompensates in the other, rather than being accurate in both. The shining coins have a behaviour that was more notable before later patches addressed part of it, but the underlying system still produces some unusual results. Shining coins are supposed to mark a path by glowing on the floor, providing navigation assistance in confusing areas. The glow is a persistent visual effect that lasts for a set duration. In some lighting conditions in the game, the glow from a shining coin gets swamped by the ambient environment lighting and becomes essentially invisible. This isn't a bug in the strict sense, it's a consequence of the rendering conditions in those areas. But it means that a consumable whose entire purpose is visibility becomes non-functional in the areas where navigation is most difficult, because those areas tend to be the ones with bright ambient lighting, like the nightmare spaces. Blood vials, the core, have an unusual interaction with the death and respawn system. When you die, your blood vials are not lost. Your blood echoes are dropped at your death location, but your inventory, including blood vials, comes with you to the respawn. However, there's a specific death type, the one triggered by the full death in the Nightmare of Mensis from the brain of Mensis. That doesn't follow this rule under very specific conditions. If you die from the brain suck effect while simultaneously triggering a full death in the same frame, the game has to resolve which death type takes priority, and in resolving that conflict there are reported instances of blood vial counts being affected in ways that don't match either death types nor. Some players have reported losing vials they shouldn't have lost. Others have reported dying with more vials than they entered the encounter with, seemingly from nowhere. The Carol rune mechanic has an item interaction anomaly related to how runes are applied and removed in specific sequences. Normally, equipping and unequipping Carol runes is a clean process. The old runes effect ends, and the new runes effect begins. But there's a small window during the equipment process, where both runes are technically active simultaneously, the old one not yet fully removed, and the new one already applied. For most rune effects, this window is inconsequential. For the Communion rune, which increases maximum, this window can momentarily show a higher maximum than either rune would provide alone, and if you use a vial during this window, the game will sometimes let you consume one more vial than your new maximum should allow before correcting the count on the next purchase or refill. The Graveguard set. The armour dropped by a specific variant of the Graveguard has a drop probability anomaly that has been documented extensively by players running the same encounter repeatedly. The probability table for this set should produce all 4 pieces at roughly equal rates across repeated kills. Instead, the trousers piece drops at approximately half the rate of the other 3 pieces. This isn't a perceived or anecdotal result. It's been confirmed through large sample sizes. The trousers item entry in the drop table appears to have a weight value that's lower than the other 3 pieces, which is almost certainly unintended since armour sets are typically balanced to drop their pieces at equal rates. The Holy Blade weapon, the Kirkhammer, has an interesting item state anomaly when you acquire it from Alfred and then interact with Alfred later in the game. If you've already purchased the Holy Blade from the Bath Messengers, before the point where Alfred would provide it as a quest reward. The game doesn't know what to do with the reward. Some players have received duplicate copies of the weapon, others have received nothing, and in one documented case, a player received a blood vial in place of the weapon, the game apparently substituting the cheapest available item in place of a reward it couldn't give. The substitution behaviour is not consistent, and seems to be a fallback the system produces when the standard reward path is blocked. The uncanny and lost weapon variants in Chalice dungeons have placement anomalies, where the same weapon can appear in multiple Chalice configurations, but with different infusions than their item description suggests they should have. The standard placements for uncanny and lost variants have specific infusion types tied to specific depths and configuration, but there are documented cases of weapons appearing with the wrong infusion type for their listed variant, specifically lost weapons appearing with uncanny infusion parameters and vice versa. The weapon name and description say one thing, the actual infusion effect says another. This appears to be a naming assignment error rather than a functional error. The weapon works as its infusion actually, not as its name suggests. The pungent blood cocktail has a secondary function that most players use deliberately, throwing it to distract the cleric beast. But it also has a passive scent radius that should, in theory, attract any beast-type enemy, and this passive radius appears to be set high enough that in certain areas, enemies that are well outside any throw range but within the detection radius of the cocktail you're carrying in inventory will have their aggro threshold lowered. Specifically, beasts in the same general space as you have a slightly reduced aggro distance when you're carrying cocktails, because the item's scent field is. This is an incredibly subtle interaction that would almost never have a practical effect, and whether it was intentional or an oversight in how the item's passive properties were set up is impossible to determine from the outside. The Madman's knowledge and Great One's wisdom consumables add insight when used. Their item descriptions position them as representative of encountered but the specific insight value they add has a minor anomaly in how it's applied, which is that using either item while at 99 insight doesn't result in the item failing to consume. You use the item, it plays the consumption animation, it adds 1 point of insight, and then the total clips at 99. The item is consumed, and no net gain is made if you were already at the maximum, which is expected. What's unexpected is that the game doesn't prevent you from using it. There's no cannot use message. It lets you burn consumable items for zero benefit without warning, a quality of life gap that has existed since. The ritual blood items used for Chalice dungeon creation have an interesting property where their quantity display in your inventory can temporarily show an incorrect count. After performing a ritual and spending ritual blood, there's a brief window where the inventory screen shows the pre-ritual quantity before updating to the post-ritual. The window is short, maybe half a second, but it's consistent, and it suggests the inventory display and the actual item count update on slightly different cycles. For most players and most situations, this is irrelevant. But in the Chalice dungeon economy, where players are often working with limited ritual blood and tracking exact counts, this display lag has caused confusion about whether the ritual actually consumed the expected materials. The eye rune has an anomaly in how its discovery bonus interacts with the Chalice dungeon item generation system. The eye rune is supposed to increase the rate of finding items dropped by slain enemies. In the main game, this works. In the Chalice dungeons, the rune appears to interact with the generated treasure room content in a way that pushes the room's contents toward higher rarity items more often than it should. This isn't the intended function of the eye rune, which is about enemy drop rates rather than treasure room. The most likely explanation is that the eye rune's discovery bonus is being applied to the Chalice treasure generation logic, because that logic shares code with the enemy drop system, and the bonus passes through to a system it was never designed to affect. The blood gems have an anomaly in their display information. Some gems display a percentage bonus, and some display a flat. When you slot a percentage gem and a flat gem of the same damage type into a weapon simultaneously, the order of operations for how these two bonuses interact is not what the UI suggests. The UI implies the percentage increases the base damage, and the flat value adds on top of that. In practice, the flat value is added first, and then the percentage is applied to the total, which produces a slightly. The difference is small enough that most players never notice it, and it rarely affects weapon optimization choices meaningfully. But the display UI actively tells you the wrong order of operations for how your weapon's damage is actually being calculated. The Quicksilver Bullet's behavior, when acquired from cutting your own wrist with the hunter's axe, is a deliberately designed mechanic, spending health to gain bullets. But the actual health cost of this behavior has an anomaly at low health values. When you're below approximately 20% of your maximum health, the health cost per bullet generation is slightly lower than the design specification suggests it should be. The full health conversion rate applies at all health values above that threshold, but below it, the cost per bullet is fractionally lower. This creates the somewhat counterintuitive outcome that generating bullets is marginally more efficient when you're nearly dead than when you're healthy. The Chalice Dungeon route generation system occasionally produces item nodes that contain items outside the expected loot pool for that dungeon depth and configuration. There are documented cases of Depth 3 chalices generating items that are coded to only appear in Depth 5 configurations, apparently because the route generation randomization draws from the full item table rather than the depth-filtered version in a small percentage of rolls. This means it's theoretically possible to find items in lower depth chalices that by the standard rules shouldn't appear there. The probability is low enough that most players will never encounter it, but it exists as a property of the generation system. The Air rune has a documented interaction with the visceral attack system that produces more echoes than the rune's stated value. The Air rune is supposed to add a flat echo gain multiplier to visceral attacks, but the calculation appears to apply the multiplier to the pre-visceral echo total rather than the base echo value, meaning the bonus scales with however many echoes you're currently carrying. This makes the Air rune substantially more valuable than its item description suggests in high echo accumulation contexts, and substantially less valuable in fresh death contexts where you're carrying minimal echoes. The interaction with your current echo count is not mentioned anywhere in the item description. The Radiant Sword Hunter badge unlocks items at the Bath Messenger that include a specific set of consumables. One consumable in that unlocked set, the throwing knife, has a price in Blood Echoes that's inconsistent with its position in the item tier. It costs fewer echoes than items that are clearly meant. The price appears to have been set for an earlier version of the consumable or for a version of the economy that changed before the game shipped, and the price wasn't updated when those other changes were made. The Tear Blood gem, dropped by a specific enemy, has a blood effect on acquisition that doesn't match any other gem in the game. Most gem acquisition animations are brief and consistent. The Tear Blood gem has a slightly extended acquisition visual, as if the item was at some point intended to have a more elaborate pickup animation that was simplified during production, leaving behind a longer than expected version of the standard animation. The Cosmic Eye Watcher badge unlocks an item set that includes a curious outlier. All other unlocked badge item sets are internally consistent in terms of which faction or narrative thread they represent. The Cosmic Eye Watcher badge set mixes items from two distinct narrative contexts, one from the Choir and one from Bergenworth, with no item description that explains the connection. This suggests either that the badge originally unlocked a different item set and was modified, or that the intended narrative connection between the two item sets was cut from the final game and the badge's unlock list wasn't reorganized to compensate. Chapter 4. The sound design breaks Bloodborne's audio design is one of its most celebrated technical achievements. The score by Yharnam and the rest of the team works in a way that feels deliberately integrated with the world. The environmental audio from the distant bells of Yharnam to the wet sounds of the beast encounters, is constructed with a density and detail that rewards headphone listening in ways that most action games never approach. Which makes the audio anomalies in Bloodborne particularly interesting, because they exist against a backdrop of exceptional intentionality. When something sounds wrong here, it really sounds wrong. The most persistent audio anomaly in the game is the bell sound in Cathedral Ward that plays at irregular intervals without a visible source. Players have tracked this sound extensively. It's not the Mother of Flies bell, it's not any bell maiden. It plays in the open area of the Cathedral Ward near the lamp, and while there is a messenger bath maiden near that lamp, whose bell could theoretically be the source, the timing of the sound doesn't match any observable state of the maiden. The bell rings when the maiden isn't doing anything, and when the maiden does ring her bell, the sound plays in addition to these irregular rings, rather than instead of them. There appears to be a background bell event that's firing independently of any visible source on a loosely random timer. The audio in the Hunter's Dream has a directionality issue at its edges. The Hunter's Dream uses a specific acoustic model that wraps the sound space around the central safe area, creating a sense of enclosed softness that makes it feel peaceful and separate from Yharnam. At the far edges of the accessible space in the dream, near the gravestones and the workshop building's back wall, the acoustic model stops wrapping correctly. The distant ambient sounds of the dream play at full volume rather than the reduced, warmly blurred volume they have at the centre. The effect is that the dream's audio becomes slightly harsh and unprocessed at its edges, a quality that probably isn't intentional, and that you'd only notice if you spent time exploring the dream's perimeter, rather than using it purely for its functional purposes. Gascoigne's music has a track transition that occasionally doesn't fire cleanly when you trigger his third phase. The phase transition is supposed to swell the music, and in most encounters it does exactly that. But in a documented set of cases, the music track shift lags behind the phase transition by 3 to 5 seconds, leaving you in a moment where the game state says Phase 3 has started, but the audio is still playing Phase 2 music. When the transition does fire, it doesn't seamlessly crossfade, it cuts. There's a brief moment of near silence. The desync between the game state and the audio state creates this strange punctuation in the fight, where the music cut tells you something changed, even though the track shift doesn't play immediately. The sound of enemies burning has an anomaly in its attenuation. Burning enemies should get quieter as you move away from them, following the standard audio distance model. But there's a specific radius, a band of distance between roughly 30 and 50 units from a burning enemy, where the burning sound actually gets slightly louder before following the normal fall-off curve further out. This inverted attenuation band is subtle enough that most players would never consciously register it, but it creates a brief moment of increasing volume as you run away from a burning enemy before the normal decrease kicks in. It sounds like the enemy is briefly following you, even when it isn't. The cleric beast's roar. It plays at a lower pitch in the walled section of the arena near the beginning of the bridge than it does in the more open central area. The beast itself hasn't changed, the audio file is the same. But the environmental acoustic processing for that walled section is applying a room model effect that includes pitch shifting as part of its reverb program. And the cleric beast's roar frequency sits in a range that the room model's pitch shifting component catches and modifies. The beast sounds slightly different, not dramatically so, but measurably in that specific section of the arena. The doll in the Hunter's Dream has ambient murmuring audio that plays when you're in proximity to her. This is intentional, but the radius of this ambient murmuring is larger than the proximity radius for her dialogue trigger. What this means is that there's a ring of space around the doll where you can hear the murmuring, but you're not close enough to trigger her dialogue. In that ring, she sounds present and aware, without being interactive. This creates a specific quality of passive presence that may have, but it could also simply be that the two radius values, the audio radius and the interaction radius, were set by different people or at different times, without being carefully coordinated. The lecture building classrooms have ambient audio of breathing or rustling that plays even when all enemies in the room have been cleared. The audio appears to be a room state audio event that fires based on the room's general setup rather than the specific presence of enemies. It's designed to play while enemies are present as part of the environmental dread, but the trigger condition doesn't check for living enemies, it checks for whether the room is in its initial state. Kill all the enemies, and the room remains in its initial state as far as the audio trigger is concerned, so the ambient breathing continues even in an empty classroom. It's a small categorization error. The audio event tied to the wrong state. The Witch of Hemwick Arena has music that loops, but the loop point is placed slightly incorrectly, or so the audio data suggests. The music has a clearly designed loop that should repeat seamlessly. But in practice, there's a very slight audio pop at the loop transition, a brief discontinuity in the waveform that's audible with headphones in a quiet. This is a mixing or export issue from the audio production stage rather than an engine problem. The waveform at the loop point doesn't quite match, suggesting the loop point was placed at a transition that crosses a slight amplitude change in the master mix. The audio trigger zones in the Forbidden Woods have an overlap issue near the transition from the initial forest path to the cave section. There are 3 distinct audio environments in that area: the general forest, the poison swamp, and the cave interior. The transition from forest to poison swamp should swap audio environments cleanly. The transition from poison swamp to cave should, but near the cave entrance, the 3 audio zones overlap, and you can find a position in the cave entrance area where you're simultaneously receiving forest ambience, swamp ambience, and cave ambience at once. All 3 play together, loudly and simultaneously, for the duration you're standing in that open. The silver beasts in the Forbidden Woods have a howl that they use to call other silver beasts in the area. The audio file for this howl plays correctly from the howling enemy's position. But the spatial awareness it triggers in other silver beasts, the aggro response to the howl, appears to use the player's position as the source point for the audio rather than the howling enemy. This means the responding silver beasts orient toward the player when alerted by the howl rather than toward the howling silver beast. This is probably correct from a gameplay design standpoint. You want the enemies to come toward you. But the mechanism is slightly backwards from what you'd expect, the howl being treated as if you generated it rather than the enemy. The Murgo's Wet Nurse fight has a specific audio anomaly during the darkness phase. When the Wet Nurse creates the black fog and multiple clones are active, the spatial audio for the Wet Nurse's attacks during that phase doesn't correctly track from the real Wet Nurse. The attack sounds come from a fixed point near the center of the arena, rather than from the attacking entity's act. This makes the audio completely non-useful as a cue for locating the real Wet Nurse during the darkness phase, which may actually be part of the design intention. But the mechanism, playing sounds from a fixed point rather than from the attacking entity, is unusual compared to how every other multi-entity audio situation in the game. The Bell Maidens have ambient audio associated with them that plays at a constant volume regardless of your distance from the maiden. Most enemy audio attenuates with distance. The Bell Maiden's specific audio doesn't. The ringing and the associated ambient tone play at full volume across the entire loaded area whenever a maiden is active. The intent is clearly to have the maiden's presence be felt throughout the area as a general pressure, but the implementation means that a Bell Maiden at the opposite end of a Chalice dungeon room sounds exactly as close as one standing next to you. The first encounter with Patches the Spider has audio behaviour where Patches' voice lines continue playing from his established position even if you move far enough away that his dialogue should have stopped. The game continues the voice over through the full line once triggered, regardless of how far, but the spatial processing of the audio continues tracking your movement rather than staying fixed at Patch's location. This means that if you move during his dialogue, the voice follows you around the room rather than becoming more distant as you'd expect from a stationary character speaking. He's staying put. His voice is following you around. The Dark Beast Parl has electric discharge audio that has a timing offset from the visual discharge. The visual and audio components of the lightning effect on Parl should synchronize so that the crack and flash happen simultaneously. But the audio appears to be triggered about a third of a second after the visual rather than simultaneously. This is a noticeable gap in a quiet environment, and it creates the impression that the lightning is slower than it looks, a subtle wrongness in an enemy whose visual signature is extremely fast electrical discharge. The footstep audio for the hunter character has a material matching system that determines what footstep sound plays based on what surface the character. This system has a gap in Cathedral Ward, on the large stone plaza before the Grand Cathedral. The surface is large cut stone, which has a specific footstep audio profile. But in a specific section of that plaza, the surface audio profile switches to wood, plays the wood footstep for about 3 steps, and then switches back to stone. There's no visible change in the floor surface. It's stone visually throughout, but the audio material assignment has a wood-tagged section in the middle of it. The shotgun blast audio, the hunter blunderbuss, and similar weapons has a reverb tail that varies inconsistently between indoor and outdoor environments. The reverb tail in outdoor environments should be shorter than indoors, which is physically correct, but certain semi-enclosed areas like the Cathedral Ward courtyard produce a reverb tail that's longer than fully enclosed areas like the Cleric Workshop, which is the opposite of what the physical acoustics of those spaces would produce. The reverb model for those semi-enclosed spaces appears to have been authored with indoor reverb parameters rather than outdoor to semi-enclosed. The Vicar Amelia boss fight has a specific audio event that plays during her healing animation when she clasps the pendant. It's a distinct sound, a soft resonant tone that plays once per healing attempt. This tone plays correctly from Amelia's position during the fight. But there's a documented case where, after defeating Amelia and transitioning to the post-fight state, the tone plays once more from an empty space where Amelia was standing. It fires exactly once, after her death, from her last position. The death state apparently doesn't clear the scheduled audio events that were queued for her animations, so the next queued audio event fires even though the entity playing it no longer exists. The ambient audio for the Nightmare of Mensis has an event where a distant voice can be heard at specific positions in the outdoor fortress area. This voice is not attached to any visible source. It plays directionally, suggesting it has a position in the world, but following the direction leads to an exterior wall with nothing. The voice sounds like a distorted version of one of the choir chants from Murgo's lullaby, which suggests it might be a bleed-through from the Murgo audio system, playing at a position that corresponds to the location of Murgo's loft in the world geometry. Heard faintly through the walls, separating the outdoor fortress from the interior spaces. The old hunter's bell in the hunter's dream has audio that plays on a fixed cycle, regardless of whether you use it during that cycle. The bell ringing sound occurs at set intervals. If you ring the bell to summon a co-op partner, the next timed ring still plays at its scheduled point, even if you just rang the bell manually. You can hear the hunter's dream bell ring twice in rapid succession if your manual ring happens to coincide with the end of the automatic cycle. The automatic ringing cycle isn't reset by manual use. The Cathedral Ward lamp activation sound has a pitch that's higher than every other lamp in the game by a noticeable interval. All lamps share the same audio asset for their activation, but the Cathedral Ward lamp's pitch is shifted up. This is either an intentional variation to make that particular lamp feel distinct, or the audio instance for that specific lamp was given a pitch modifier that wasn't applied to any other lamp. Given that the variation is confined to a single lamp, and that lamp isn't narratively significant in a way that would motivate a distinct audio, the accidental explanation feels more likely. The River of Blood in Yharnam, the liquid flowing through the lower channels of the unseen village, has water audio that plays at a volume calibrated for a moving body of water seen from close range. But the River of Blood is partially enclosed by architecture and only audible from above in many areas of the volume doesn't attenuate upward as it should if the sound source is at the bottom of the channel. You hear the river at the same volume from 20 feet above it as you do from standing at its edge. The audio doesn't respect vertical distance in the way it respects horizontal distance. The celestial emissary final form has a size-scaling audio anomaly. When the emissary enlarges for the final phase, its footstep sounds are supposed to scale with the size increase, heavier and more impactful than the small-form emissary footsteps. The visual transformation is dramatic. But the footstep audio doesn't update to the scaled version in the first few steps after transformation. The large emissary takes its first 3 to 4 steps with the small form footstep audio before the audio system updates the sound parameters. Then the heavier footsteps kick in. The first few footfalls of the giant emissary sound like a small creature walking, which is disorienting in a context inconsistent. The Orphan of Kos has a cry that functions as both a narrative element and a gameplay audio cue for its attack winds. The cry volume during the fight changes depending on how much health the Orphan has lost, which is an intentional dynamic mixing decision. But there's an anomaly where the cry volume resets to its starting value if the Orphan performs the slam attack that embeds the placenta in the ground. The slam appears to trigger a volume reset in the cry's dynamic parameter rather than simply continuing the downward volume curve. After the slam, the cry is briefly louder than it should be at that health value before the dynamic mixing curve takes it back down. The ticking sound effect that plays near clockwork type mechanisms in the game is at a slightly incorrect tempo for 2 specific mechanisms, one in the research hall and one in a chalice dungeon room. The intended tempo appears to be tied to a visual rotation rate of a gear component. On these 2 mechanisms, the visual rotation and the audio tempo are offset by about 50, with the audio ticking faster than the visual rotation would generate. This produces a subtle percussive mismatch between what you see and what you hear, a mechanism that sounds like it's turning faster than it looks. The gunshot sounds from enemy hunters, the invading NPC hunters you encounter in specific world states, sometimes play with a reverb tail consistent with an indoor environment when those hunters are fighting you outdoors. The reverb for the gunshot sound appears to be globally set for those specific enemy types based on a default environment rather than the environment they're currently occupying. You fight an NPC hunter on the open streets of Yharnam and their gun sounds like it went off in a small room. The music that plays during the Celestial Emissary fight transitions to a distinct track for the boss phase. The track transition fires when you enter the fog gate. But if you die in the boss room and re-enter, the music handles the transit, fading the current track rather than cutting to the boss track. This produces a different audio experience on your second and subsequent attempts than on your first. The fade version is slightly less dramatic than the cut version, and the practical effect is that the fight feels slightly different atmospherically if you've died in it before compared to a first attempt experience. The ambient crowd sounds in central Yharnam, the distant shouts and howls of the mob, have a maximum volume value that gets briefly exceeded during specific times of night in the game world's implied timeline. Bloodborne doesn't have an explicitly tracked time system, but the audio events in the environment follow a procedural schedule. At certain points in that schedule, multiple mob audio events trigger simultaneously, and the combined output exceeds the design ceiling of the ambient audio channel. The result is a brief spike in the mob noise volume that makes the crowd momentarily louder than the environment is meant to support. It's not dramatic, but in a game that's generally carefully mixed, the volume spike stands out. Chapter 5. The NPCs who remember things they shouldn't. Bloodborne's NPC system is built around state flags. Every NPC tracks a set of conditions about the world. things the player has done, bosses they've killed, items they've delivered, and dialogues they've heard, and uses those flags to determine what to say and how to behave. It's a clean system in principle, and it works correctly the vast majority. But there's a category of NPC behaviour in Bloodborne, where the flags seem to be tracking something slightly different from what the NPC's behaviour implies, where NPCs respond to conditions that shouldn't yet be true, or fail to respond to conditions that clearly are. The suspicious beggar in the Forbidden Woods is one of the most behaviourally complex NPCs in the game, with multiple possible outcomes depending on choices and timing. His state machine has at least one documented anomaly where he can appear to have killed residents of Odin Chapel before you've sent any residents there, specifically the Gascoigne's daughter child. If you advance through his quest arc in a specific way and then return to the chapel, you can find the begging stranger in a state that implies the chapel killing has occurred, but the child is simultaneously still alive and speaking her dialogue. Two conflicting state conditions coexist for a brief period before the system resolves the inconsistency on your next visit. Eileen the Crow has a dialogue state that acknowledges your progress in hunting the Hunter of Hunters targets before you've technically reached the relevant point in her questline. If you encounter her in Odin Chapel and have already killed a specific invading hunter that her questline involves, she'll occasionally deliver dialogue that references the kill. This dialogue is supposed to require a separate dialogue trigger to unlock. But there's a path through the game where the kill happens before the trigger condition is set, and Eileen uses the post-trigger dialogue anyway, suggesting that the dialogue unlock system is tracking the kill flag directly rather than requiring the intermediate conversation. Dura has a state change after you've spoken with him and he agrees to stand down, and this state change has an anomaly when he dies before the agreement is reached. If Dura is killed by another enemy in the game, specifically the huntsman NPCs that patrol in his vicinity, his death state flag updates correctly, but his aggro state. The result is that revisiting Old Yharnam after Dura has been killed by an NPC rather than by the player shows an empty tower, the Gatling gun silent, but if you enter Dura's aggro zone, the Gatling gun firing sound briefly plays from the empty tower before stopping. The aggro response fires and immediately cancels because there's no entity to execute it. The doll in the Hunter's Dream has a particularly interesting NPC state anomaly related to the emote system. The doll responds to certain emotes performed near her, including the pray emote, which she acknowledges with a specific dialogue line. But the state that tracks whether you've performed this emote combination appears to persist in a way that other emote interactions don't. Most emote-triggered responses can be repeated on subsequent visits. The doll's pray response can only be triggered once per playthrough. This wouldn't be anomalous, except that the response re-enables after entering a new Game Plus cycle, which requires a separate flag, but doesn't re-enable after simply reloading the area, which uses the same flag for most other. The doll's pray flag is persistent in a way that other NPC response flags in the dream aren't. Alfred has a questline that involves obtaining the unopened summons from Cainhurst and giving it to him. If you obtain the summons and then give it to Alfred, he departs toward Cainhurst. If you then die and respawn without having yet visited Cainhurst yourself, Alfred has a position state anomaly where he's simultaneously tracked as having departed and as not having arrived at Cainhurst. On your next visit to Cainhurst during this in-between state, Alfred appears in the wrong location within the castle, a position that corresponds to an earlier version of his questline path, rather than the final position where you'd expect to find him. Ariana, the eldest woman in Odin Chapel, has a state flag for when she gives you her blood. That state flag properly prevents her from giving you another vial of her blood on subsequent visits. But there's a specific loading order issue where, if you reload the area in a particular sequence involving the lamp in the chapel and the gate near the Cleric Beast Bridge, Ariana's Give Blood flag briefly resets, and she'll offer her blood again. If you take it before the flag corrects, you receive a second vial. The correction fires on your next full area load, and she returns to her standard post-blood given dialogue. This suggests the flag is tied to a loading event that fires slightly after the character herself loads, creating the window. Adela the nun has a particularly complex state machine because her behaviour is conditional on Ariana's state. If Ariana has given you blood, and you've given that blood to a specific NPC, and you then revisit Adela in a specific sequence, she should be hostile. But there's a case where Adela's hostility state hasn't updated while Ariana's offering state has, and you can speak with Adela in a neutral state while Ariana's condition should have already made Adela hostile. The two NPCs are meant to operate as link states, but the update propagation between them isn't always instantaneous. The choir servant in Yharnam who sells specific items has an inventory state that doesn't fully reset between visits in the same session. Buying out her entire inventory of a specific item and then reloading the area should restock her inventory. In most cases it does. But there's a sequence where the restock fires before the player's purchase transactions are fully committed, resulting in a brief period where the merchant shows full stock, but the player has already paid for the items that should have depleted it. Buying another set of the same items in that window charges the player again for items the transaction log suggests have already been purchased. The lonely old deer in Odin Chapel has dialogue that references events she couldn't logically know about. One specific line she delivers, after you've killed a certain number of enemies in the Forbidden Woods, seems to acknowledge the player's activities in an area she has no connection to and no way of receiving information about. The most functional explanation is that her dialogue is keyed to a flag that happens to be set by Forbidden Woods enemy kills, but was intended to be a general progress marker for the game's midpoint rather than specifically about the woods. But the line itself, the specific words she uses, sounds like she knows what's been happening in the forest in a way that feels like a broken. Father Gascoigne as an NPC, before the boss fight, has a brief interactive moment in the graveyard where you can speak to him and he'll say a line or two. The trigger for this interaction has an anomaly where it can fire during the boss fight, instead of before it under specific conditions. If you trigger the pre-boss interaction and then get hit into the fog gate from behind, the scene plays out in a partially wrong order, with Gascoigne in his fight state delivering his pre-fight dialogue. This particular flag conflict produces dialogue lines in an order that doesn't make narrative sense, and produces a Gascoigne who is simultaneously calm and in his werewolf transitioning combat state. Patches the spider, appearing in the lecture hall, has a state where he talks to you through the barred door. The door-barred state persists across reloads correctly, but there's an anomaly where if you kill a brain-sucker enemy in a specific room adjacent to Patches' room and then immediately attempt to interact with Patches through the door, Patches gives dialogue that's flagged for a later point in the interaction rather than the early stage greeting. The brain-sucker kill is setting a flag that the dialogue system is reading as a progress indicator for Patches' questline, which it isn't intended to be. The brain-sucker kill and Patches' dialogue stage shouldn't have any relationship, but the flag assignment is treating them as connected. Iosefka's voice from behind the clinic door has a well-documented dual state. The real Iosefka is replaced by an imposter at a certain point in the game's progression, and the clinic door is never opened during this transition. The voice changes at the transition point. But there's a very specific window in the game's progression where you can interact with the door and receive audio that blends the real Iosefka's verbal patterns on some lines and the imposter's on others in the same conversation. This blending shouldn't be possible given that the NPC is replaced rather than augmented. But the transition appears to have a brief state where both dialogue sets are accessible. The Messenger Bath Maidens have a state system that tracks which items you've purchased. In most cases this works, but there's a documented case where purchasing an item from the messenger in the Hunter's Dream and then dying before the game saves creates a state where the purchase is logged in the transaction register, but the item isn't removed from the messenger's stock. On your next visit, the item is available for purchase again despite your transaction log showing it as previously purchased. The echo cost is charged again. You can buy the same item twice with no indication from the game that this is happening. Simon the Harrowed in The Hunter's Nightmare has quest state tracking that involves him appearing at multiple locations through the Dilk. His position update system has an anomaly where, after dying and respawning from a specific location in the nightmare, Simon appears in two positions simultaneously. More precisely, his model appears at his intended current position, but his interaction trigger remains at his previous position. You can interact with Simon from across the room, because his dialogue trigger is still at his last location, while his visible presence has moved to the new one. Lady Maria has no NPC dialogue state, since she's purely a boss, but data miners have found that she has a dialogue state system in the game data that was never activated, with flags for multiple conversation stages and a questline structure. The anomaly here isn't a behaviour you see in the game, it's the gap between what was built and what was activated. Her data suggests she was at one point planned to be an NPC with a questline before being repositioned as the DLC's main boss fight. The NPC state system for her was built, the content was created, and then the activation flags were never set. All of it sits in the game data. Dormant. Valter, Master of the League, has a summoning state that has a documented anomaly in the Nightmare of Mensis. His summon sign should appear at a specific location in the exterior of the nightmare if you have the League staff equipped and have met his questline conditions. But there's a second summon sign for Valter that appears in an incorrect location, inside one of the nightmare's rooms rather than at the exterior, that has the same activation conditions but wasn't intentionally placed there. The sign has the correct dialogue and functions correctly if you use it. It just shouldn't be there. It's in a room that Valter has no narrative connection to, and using it places his summon in a position relative to the room's entrance, rather than relative to the boss encounter it's supposed to support. The plain doll's expressions change subtly at specific points in the game's progression. Specifically, her smile becomes slightly more pronounced after you've acquired certain insight thresholds. This is intentional. But there's a threshold where the expression change fires slightly ahead of schedule, visible at an insight value 1 below, where the change is supposed to trigger. The expression update condition appears to be checking 1 less than the intended threshold. You can see the slightly altered doll expression while still 1 insight point short of the intended trigger. Gehrman's NPC presence in the Hunter's Dream changes throughout the game in ways that track your story progression. One specific behavioural change, the point where he stops offering his generic early game dialogue and transitions to his later game reflective dialogue, has a trigger that fires based on a boss kill count rather than a specific boss kill. Kill enough bosses and Gehrman transitions, regardless of which bosses they are. This means you can trigger Gehrman's late game dialogue state while having skipped content that the dialogue implicitly references, creating conversations where Gehrman refers to events that you haven't technically witnessed. Chapter 6. When the World Loads Wrong. Bloodborne is built on a streaming system that loads and unloads geometry, textures, and entities as you move through the world. The system is designed to be invisible, to make Yharnam feel like a continuous space that exists in its entirety rather than a series of assembled chunks that load in on demand. Most of the time, it achieves this. The city feels continuous, the environments feel persistent, and the transition between areas is managed through doors and fog gates and cliffs that provide natural visual breaks during which the system can do its work. But sometimes the loading system is visible, and when you can see it working, it reveals a lot about how the world is actually structured. The most frequently observed loading anomaly in Bloodborne involves the area transition between the central Yharnam gate and the area leading toward Old Yharnam. This transition is marked by the large gate that you unlock with the sewer key. When you unlock and pass through this gate for the first time, There's a small but consistent geometry pop where the area on the other side loads in about a half second after the gate opens. The far side of the gate appears black, then snaps to the loaded geometry. The snap is brief, and most players attribute it to a slow hard drive. But the pop happens on every playthrough, regardless of storage hardware, which suggests it's a streaming trigger placed slightly too close to the gate rather than a hardware-dependent issue. The Forbidden Woods entrance from the Forbidden Woods lamp has a loading state that produces an occasional missing texture event on first entry. A section of the tree canopy overhead will appear without its texture for a moment, showing the grey underlying mesh before the texture streams in. The texture streaming priority for that canopy section appears to be lower than it should be given how immediately visible it is on entry. The texture pops in within 2 to 3 seconds, but there's a consistent window of grey mesh visible overhead at the Forbidden Woods entry point. The connection between the Hemwick Charnel Lane and the Cathedral Ward has a bidirectional loading anomaly. Travelling from Cathedral Ward into Hemwick, the area behind you in Cathedral Ward partially unloads before you're far enough into Hemwick for it to be necessary. If you immediately turn around after the transition, the gate area of Cathedral Ward is missing some of its detailed geometry. Travelling from Hemwick back into Cathedral Ward, the opposite happens. The Hemwick geometry doesn't unload fast enough, and you can still see the Hemwick Road extending behind you into the loaded Cathedral Ward for several seconds. Two areas that shouldn't be simultaneously visible are briefly visible together. Yharnam has a loading behaviour tied to its dual-state design that produces visible artefacts when you visit the area repeatedly in a single session. The first transition into either Yharnam state loads cleanly. Subsequent transitions within the same session occasionally produce moments where the previous state's lighting persists for a second or two into the daytime. Yharnam can look momentarily nighttime at the transition, or vice versa, before the lighting state corrects. The lighting is loaded on a slightly different cycle than the geometry, and the geometry loads faster than the lighting up. The Nightmare Frontier transition from the Amygdala Fog Gate back to the Nightmare Frontier area has a persistent anomaly where the starting position on re-entry doesn't match the exit position from the Fog Gate. Entering the Fog Gate from the Nightmare Frontier side places you in the boss arena. Exiting the boss arena returns you to a position slightly further back from the Fog Gate. Over multiple runs, this means you're consistently exiting from a slightly different position than you entered from, and the return position is further from the Fog Gate each time until you take the lamp. This suggests the exit position is being set by a fixed coordinate rather than the inverse of the entry. The shortcut door in central Yharnam, the one that connects the Cleric Beast Bridge approach to the lower sewer area, has a loading trigger tied to opening the door rather than to approaching it. This means the area on the other side loads on the door open event rather than on your proximity to the door. In most circumstances, this produces the intended seamless transition, but if you open the door and immediately back away from it rather than walking through, you can see the area beyond the door load in while you're standing at a distance, the suddenly present geometry appearing in the door frame while you're well away from it. The research hall loading seam, mentioned earlier in the context of geometry, becomes particularly visible during a specific climbing sequence. There's a ladder near the upper portion of the research hall that crosses the loading boundary between the lower and upper sections. Climbing this ladder, you can catch the upper section loading in as you ascend. The upper portion of the research hall simply doesn't exist when you're at the bottom of this ladder, and it appears in full visual complexity within the 3 seconds it takes to climb the ladder. The ladder's length is calculated to cover the loading time, but the timing isn't quite right for all hardware configurations, and on faster hardware you can see the geometry appear while you're still mid-climb. The lecture building's 2 floors, as mentioned regarding geometry, are separate loaded environments. The transition between them is handled by a staircase, but the actual loading boundary is at the door at the top of the stairs, not at the staircase itself. This means that while ascending the stairs, you're in the lower lecture building environment but spatially positioned at a point that corresponds to the upper floor's layout. If you look down through the stair railing during the ascent, you see the lower floor extending away from you at the correct geometry. But looking up through the floorboards of the upper floor while ascending reveals the absence of the upper floor's geometry until you reach the door trigger, at which point it loads. The staircase briefly occupies an uncanny space between two environments that can't simultaneously be seen from it under normal conditions. The Nightmare of Mensis has streaming behaviour for the brain of Mensis that's distinct from every other large enemy in the game. The brain is a very large piece of geometry with complex transparency effects, and it loads as a separate streaming unit from the rest of the Mensis exterior. On initial entry to the exterior area, there's a consistent window of approximately 1 to 2 seconds where the brain simply isn't there. The rest of the area is fully loaded, the winter lanterns are present, the architecture is complete, and then the brain loads in, appearing suddenly in its position high above the fortress. Given the brain's role in the area's atmosphere, this loading pop undermines the intended sense of encountering a terrible thing that was always there. The Canehurst approach, the road through the snow leading up to the castle, has a streaming anomaly where the castle itself loads from a direction that doesn't correspond to the approach path. The castle appears to load its geometry starting from the left side rather than from the centre or the nearest visible face. This makes the castle appear to materialise from the left side during the approach, with the right wing appearing briefly last. The visual effect of a Gothic castle building itself from left to right as you walk toward it is subtle but strange, and it only appears on first approach, before the geometry is cached. The fishing hamlet loading behaviour has an anomaly with the sea geometry. The ocean surrounding the hamlet is a large continuous piece of geometry with animated wave effects. On first entry to the hamlet, the wave animation starts from a static position and accelerates to its normal pace over about 3 seconds, rather than entering mid-animation at its standard pace. This means the ocean surrounding the fishing hamlet is briefly and disconcertingly still on every first entry, before gradually coming to life. The static to animated transition is a streaming artifact, the animation state starting from 0 rather than from a mid-cycle. The Hunter's Nightmare entry from the Old Hunter Bell has a loading anomaly that produces a sky state error on roughly 1 in 20 entries. The Hunter's Nightmare has a specific sky, a burning reddish sky with ash falling. On the anomalous entry events, the sky loads in the state of the Nightmare of Mensis sky, the blank pale sky of the deeper nightmare, before correcting to the intended. The correction happens within a second. But there's a flash of wrong sky, as if the game briefly loaded you into the wrong nightmare before sorting out which one you were actually entering. The abandoned old workshop, the secret area found by descending from the cathedral tower, has a loading sequence that doesn't fully load its props until you've descended a specific. The workshop space exists as empty geometry for the first 2 seconds after entry, with the hanging effigies, the workshop tools, and the seated figure loading in progressively after your position triggers their load priority. The space loads from the entrance inward, which means you can be standing in the workshop looking at empty geometry before the objects that make the space meaningful appear around you. The connection between the upper cathedral ward and the orphanage has a loading issue on the interior side. Entering the orphanage from the upper cathedral ward side loads the orphanage correctly, but the returning path from the orphanage back into the ward's exterior has a brief period where the sky is incorrect. The upper cathedral ward has a clear night sky with a visible moon. For approximately 1 second after exiting the orphanage back into the ward, the sky shows the enclosed interior sky value, the blank ceiling sky used for interior spaces, before updating to the exterior night sky value. The lecture building has a loading behaviour where the amygdala encounter in the upstairs room doesn't load the amygdala entity until you're a specific distance into the room. The room itself loads fully, but the amygdala, which is the largest entity in that space, loads separately and appears in the room after you've already entered it. This creates the effect of walking into what appears to be an empty room and then having a giant amygdala appear several steps later. Whether this gap is intentional, allowing the player to enter and orient before the encounter begins, or whether it's purely a streaming timing issue, is something players have debated. The effect, whatever its cause, is distinctly eerie. The Old Hunters DLC has a loading handshake with the base game that occasionally fails in a specific way. After completing content in the Hunter's Nightmare and returning to the base game via a lamp, there's a small window where base game NPCs that share state with DLC content show incorrect states. Specifically, certain NPCs who should have advanced their dialogue based on your DLC progress instead show their pre-DLC dialogue on the first interaction after returning. The state's correct on your next visit to that NPC. The DLC to base game return process apparently doesn't always flush the NPC state cache before it's first. The Chalice Dungeon loading system has an anomaly with the depth of field settings. Each dungeon environment is supposed to load with specific depth of field parameters that contribute to the visual atmosphere. But there's a consistent moment after loading into a Chalice Dungeon room where the depth of field setting from the loading screen is applied to the first, second or two of the loading screen uses a shallow depth of field for its visual effect. For the first moments in a dungeon room, everything appears slightly blurred at mid and far distances before the dungeon's own depth of field setting takes over. The streaming of distant lanterns in Yharnam has an anomaly where their glow effects don't scale correctly with streaming distance. Close lanterns have a specific glow. That bloom effect should reduce in intensity as the lantern is streamed at a lower quality level in the distance. But the bloom intensity for some distant lanterns doesn't scale down with their quality level. You get a full intensity bloom glow from a low-quality lantern model in the distance, which produces bright light points floating against simplified geometry in a way that looks. The Nightmare Frontier has an area near the poison zone where terrain geometry streams in a visible concentric pattern around the player as you move. Normally, the streaming boundary is far enough ahead of the player that you never see it in motion. In this specific area of the frontier, the boundary is closer than elsewhere, and moving through the area you can see the ground geometry extending ahead of you with the ring's forward edge clearly visible as you move. The terrain appears to grow out of nothing a set distance ahead of you throughout this section. The hunters in Chalice Dungeons, the NPC hunter enemies, have a loading state where their weapons don't load at the same time as their bodies. On first aggro in some Chalice rooms, an enemy hunter will have its body model and animations playing for a fraction of a second before the weapon model appears in their hands. The body is already performing a weapon-ready stance and then the weapon appears mid-stance. It's a texture streaming priority issue, where the body is given higher load priority than the weapon equipment. The Forbidden Woods has a streaming boundary that becomes visible at night in the more open areas of the forest, where the sky is partially visible between the canopy. At the streaming boundary, the tree models switch from their high-quality versions to low-quality versions, and this switch is visible against the night sky as a slight change in the silhouette complexity of the tree line. If you look at the distant tree line in those open areas, you can see the exact streaming boundary as a ring around you where tree complexity drops. The night sky contrast makes the silhouette change sharp enough to distinguish. The return trip from the Thumerian labyrinth bosses back to the surface has a persistent audio loading anomaly where the hunter's dream music begins playing slightly before the transition animation completes. The dream music should begin precisely but the audio loads a fraction of a second before the visual transition from the boss room to the dream completes, creating a brief moment where the dream music is playing, but you're still visually in the boss room. The Orphan of Kos fight arena, the fishing hamlet beach, has lighting that loads from the hamlet's interior values, and then transitions to the beach exterior values over about 3 seconds. This is a legitimate streaming transition for a space that's large and visually complex. But the transition includes the moonlight changing angle, which is not something lighting normally does in real time in Bloodborne. The moon is in a fixed position for the scene. During the 3-second transition, the moon's shadow direction changes before settling at its intended angle for the fight. You briefly see a beach lit from a slightly wrong direction before the lighting settles. Chapter 7. Phantom Events and Unscripted Triggers. There's a category of anomaly in Bloodborne that's harder to classify than geometry issues or audio problems. And that's the category of things that happen without apparent cause. Events that trigger outside their scripted conditions. Animations that play when nothing should have called them.